Hello, and welcome to South America's Independence Day. This is a bicentennial commemoration of the Battle of Ayacucho in Peru on December 9th, 1824. So we are 200 years exactly to the day today presenting a bicentenary of the Battle of Ayacucho and the liberation of South America as a whole. It's a great privilege and honor to be here. My name is Marie Arana. I am a writer. I am the former literary director of the Library of Congress and very honored to be on the Scholars Circle of the Kluge Center here at the John W. Kluge Center, which is the principal host of this program today. I want to thank the Kluge Center personally, myself, for having written 3 of my books here at the Kluge Center. Phenomenal experience and a wonderful staff at the Kluge Center. I want to thank also Ambassador Alfredo Ferrero of the Embassy of Peru in the United States. Thank you very much for helping us put this program together. And I also want to thank the Hispanic Reading Room of the Library of Congress, which is also a host of this program. I want to especially thank my 2 colleagues who are sitting here. They are exceptional scholars on the history of South America, the Andean region, and Peru. And Natalia Sobrevilla, most recently of the University of Kent in the United Kingdom, and Eric Langer of Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. So first, let me introduce Natalia. Natalia will give us an overview of the Battle of Ayacucho and why, exactly 200 years ago today, it was such a seminal moment for the history of the entire continent. I'll then give a more personal view, a testimonial, if you will, of my own family's history in the Battle of Ayacucho. It was that family history actually that prompted me and ultimately led me to write a biography of Simón Bolívar, who was the liberator who led Peru to independence and finally concluded Spain's hold on South America. Last on the program is Eric Langer, a distinguished professor of Latin American history, whose work recently has focused predominantly on one specific soldier. It's a marvelous, marvelous story, an officer in the Irish Legion of Bolivar's army, Francis Burdett O'Connor, and the history of Bolivia, a country that was created soon after the Battle of Ayacucho. So first, to introduce Natalia, who will speak first. Natalia Sobrevilla Perea was most recently a professor of Latin American history at the University of Kent, as I mentioned, where she taught for 17 years. She obtained her PhD at the University of London and has been a visiting fellow at Yale University, the John Carter Brown Library, and the Freie Universität in Berlin. Natalia has held grants for the British Academy, the British Library, the Leverhulme Trust, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. She has published extensively on Latin American independence in English as well as in Spanish. Her most recent books in English are Independence and Nation Building in Latin America and Race and Identity in the Crucible of War. Between 2015 and 2018, she led an international network of scholars researching the wars of independence and the idea of nation. She's published extensively on the creation of the state in Peru, focusing on its elections, constitutions, and the importance of the armed forces. Her latest book on this subject will be published by Cambridge University Press. And I should also mention that Natalia and I are cousins. We share a great-great-grandfather on my father's side. My grandfather was Arana Sobrevilla, so we are related through Toribio Sobrevilla. So it's a thrill for me to have my cousin here. We discovered this actually when we were both residents at the John Carter Brown Library and living in the same house and sharing meals together. And I said Sobrevilla, and she said Arana, and so there we established our relationship. So Natalia, please, if you will, give us your presentation, your views on the Battle of Ayacucho.
Thank you so much, Mary, for the introduction. I want to thank, first of all, the Kluge Center for the invitation, the Ambassador of Peru for his presence, and particularly Mary for having me here, for inviting me, and dragging me away from the battlefield, which is where I was supposed to be today. I have been several times to the battlefield, and here I'm going to share a small clip. This is the monument that commemorates the Battle of Ayacucho, and it was put together in 1974 by the then, and this is some of the roads that lead to it. Just going back to give you a little bit more of that view, this monument was created for the 150-year anniversary. And it's interesting to me to think that it has taken 50 years for us to start thinking and rethinking what independence has meant. I not need to remind anybody present here that you will all be very soon back in commemoration mode here in Washington. It's only 2 years until the big commemoration of the American Revolution begins. 1776 was a huge year for many reasons. In the region, it was the moment when the Spanish crown created the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. It was also the moment where the 4th of July, 1776, there was the Declaration of Independence. Here we have Washington crossing the Delaware in a very famous painting, of course painted in the mid-19th century, a very heroic moment. So I find it very moving to actually be here in Washington and not at the battlefield where I hear from my friends who are there, it's raining and they're trying to do a small recreation. Every year, the people from Ayacucho and the town of Quinoa, they get together and they recreate the battle. So today I want to talk about commemorations, but I also want to talk about, as it says on the title of my presentation, 15 years of war. But of course, it's also 50 years, or nearly 50 years, of conflict, of this so-called age of revolutions, the moment when world views change, where there was a jump on the idea, a change in the idea of how people should be governed. Who should have the sovereignty? Should it be a king, or should it be the people themselves? And that was one of the first things, and that's why I go back to the American Revolution and the importance of course, the notion of there should be no taxation without representation, and who has the right to rule. Because what is behind these whole huge shifts in historical moments is precisely this notion of who has the right to govern. These wars were fought on many levels for many reasons, but mostly because there was a debate over who had that right. And here, of course, it is to me a privilege to be and an honor to be here at the Library of Congress, the place where this discussion really begins. But then, of course, we have the French Revolution, another great moment in the history of the age of revolution, the moment when, again, kings lose their heads. But not just that, there is the Declaration of the Rights of Man linked to the French Revolution. They create one of the first constitutions. Of course, the United States had already done the Constitution in 1787, but in the 1791 Constitution and the notion of the abolition of slavery, there's going to be huge changes, not just in France, but of course also in Haiti. This is another great and important moment in the age of revolutions. Some of those ideas of the French and some of those ideas of the American Revolution are going to be very important. This again is a painting from the 19th century trying to show this slave rebellion that took on the notion of the abolition of slavery that had been presented in the French Revolution and brought it together into a huge slave rebellion. By then, Napoleon had already become a very important force in Europe, in France. He had begun as a consul, and then eventually, by 1804, he had himself crowned as This is very fast. So Napoleon is crowned this, in 1804. Mary, of course, who's written about Bolivar, can tell you that Bolivar was in Paris when this event happened. So many of these things are happening simultaneously. And what is happening in Hispanic America at the time is that there is still the belief that the people from the Spanish colonies belong in the Hispanic monarchy. Throughout all these years, in 1805, after the Battle of Trafalgar, when the Spanish lose control over the seas, the British are going to try twice to invade the very southern part of the continent in 1806 and 1807. They are going to send troops, marines, boats to Montevideo and Buenos Aires. And in those years, just before, at the very beginning of this process, there is a rejection of these foreign troops, and there is a huge movement of loyalty to the King of Spain in these regions that only 5 years later are going to have a very different view of what is going to happen. So Napoleon is going to have a huge impact in this process. As I said before, the ideas of representation are going to be very important. In the case of Peru, quite close to the time of the American Revolution in 1780, we have the largest indigenous uprising of Tupac Amaru in the southern area of Cusco, and he rises with the idea that he wants to end with bad government, but in defense of the king. Very quickly, this transforms into a racially diverse mix of Peruvian indigenous people, African descendant people, mixed race people that are trying to assert their own identity. But the revolution, the rebellion of Tupac Amaru fails, it doesn't go forward. So there is still loyalty very much as the prevailing issue there. But I keep Napoleon here because in 1808, he is going to invade the Spanish peninsula and he's going to take captive the King of Spain. And that's going to be a pivotal moment of change. And that's when I kind of start thinking of the 15 years of war. Because what happens? Once the king is taken over by Napoleon in 1808, some people in the Spanish peninsula say, if the king is absent, the sovereignty, the right to rule, returns to the people. And they create their own juntas de gobierno. Napoleon wants his brother to take over as King of Spain. It's not that the king has died, because if the king dies, then there's a new king. It's more a question of this legitimacy. Who has the right to rule? And here we have, I'm not sure how big this comes out. These are some maps that I put together with a team. We had the Leverhulme Trust. And here I show the juntas de gobierno, the autonomous governments that were organized in different parts of South America. There were also one an attempt in Mexico. And of course, in Mexico, there's a movement that is quite slightly different with Miguel Hidalgo. But we have the first juntas in La Paz and in Quito in 1809. And when the first junta is organized in Chuquisaca and then in La Paz in July 1809, the Viceroy of Peru is going to declare that if the king is absent, he is still the Viceroy, he's still in charge. And therefore, this war begins in the southern Andes between troops sent from the southern provinces of Peru, Cusco, Arequipa, Puno, into what today is Bolivia. Eric will talk more about that. But war begins very early in this region. Troops sent from the Virreinato del Río de la Plata, created in 1776, are going to try to take over. So wars are going to be quite intense in those years. And here I have some of those wars mapped out, some of the places that go up and down. I have some of the years of the main battles. And you can see that we have intervened on that map, and we're not showing our present-day borders of any of the countries that you would now identify as the countries there. We're showing huge gaps where, for instance, the areas of the Amazon that were not controlled by any of the viceroyalties or by the Kingdom of Brazil. And we're showing the southern part of both Chile and Argentina today, again, as areas that are not controlled by any of these places. So the expeditions are going to be put forward. There's going to be a whole desire to bring change in certain regions and desire to keep and maintain the situation as it was for a very long time. In 1814, the king is going to return to Spain. In the meantime, in his absence, there has been a constitution put forward for the whole Hispanic monarchy. So they want to turn the Spanish monarchy into a constitutional monarchy. So again, there is a shift in this idea of why kings should rule and how they should rule. And at the backdrop are all these wars, where all these men, all these personal experiences that Marie and Eric are going to go into much more detail in a minute, are going to be formed. Someone like Antonio José de Sucre is going to become involved in these wars at a very young age. He's from Cumaná, from the very north of the continent. Someone like José de San Martín or José de la Mar have actually fought against the Napoleonic troops in Spain because they had moved to Spain as children. They had grown up in Spain and become part of the Spanish army and have all that experience and then go to America. Many of the men who are going to participate at the Battle of Ayacucho are first going to have participated in these wars against the troops from Buenos Aires. I'm thinking of someone like Agustín Gamarra, who was the chief of staff at the Battle of Ayacucho, originally from Cusco, who had enrolled in 1809 in these armies organized in the southern provinces of Peru, and who only decided to change for the site of independence in as late as 1821, when San Martín was already in Peru. So just to give you this idea of a very constant and intense warfare. We remember in Peru the proclamation of independence of 1821, the 28th of July, and many people have recently asked me, why, if we celebrated the bicentennial on the 28th of July of 1821, are we celebrating again? Because what happened was that San Martín, who came through the southern Andes, through Chile, through the Pacific Ocean, into Lima, believed very strongly that by taking the capital city, he would take the whole of the viceroyalty. But that was not the fact. What happened was the people who had defended the king moved further south, established a new viceregal capital in Cusco, and continued to maintain a whole region of Peru loyal to the king. So this is why, even though this is a very emblematic moment of independence, it is not really the moment that we're commemorating today, because the period between the 28th of July 21 and the 9th of December 24 was a moment of very intense conflict and war. And here I move quite swiftly in the minutes that I have left to the Battle of Junín. And the Battle of Junín, which was commemorated on the 6th of August, 1824, it was an impressive battle. This is an altitude, I'm not very good with feet, it's 4,200 meters high. So that's more than 10,000 feet, I think. So 12,000 feet, thanks Eric. It's very high. This is a plain at the altitude not far from Lima. If you just think of geographically, if you look at the map, it's just behind Lima, but you have the whole Andean range in between. And we have Bolívar, and Marie will talk more about him, who's prepared his army. He's come from Colombia, and he's prepared his army in the high altitude of the provinces north of Junín, in the provinces of Cajamarca, Huaraz, and La Libertad, to train his soldiers to withstand the altitude. And here we see how the troops from those defending the king are moving from south to north because they had been in the area of Cusco, going towards the lake, and they want to go and separate the troops that are fighting for independence, the ones that are in blue. But eventually they meet. The Battle of Junín is only 45 minutes long. It's only cavalry. There's not a single shot that is thrown out because it's very, very quick. And very, very quickly, the royalists, who had been very successful in controlling the whole Andean region, lose grip of the central Andean space of Junín and Huancayo, the valley of Mantaro, and that's when they start to run behind them. And this is another map of the campaign. You can see there Cusco, which is surrounded by red, and you can see how the royalist army is going to try to envelop, to kind of go around. The other thing is, those lines you see are rivers, but here we do not have the mountain ranges. So in between each of those rivers, you have huge mountains on both sides. So think about the practicality of transporting now 9,000 men at the beginning of the campaign. By then, they're probably already just 7,000 on each side. We have several months, the months that go between August and December, we have the troops marching and counter-marching in all this area. Now, one last thing I'd like to say about this is that a lot of the soldiers that are fighting for the royalists are actually being forced to do so. Most of them are from Peruvian Andean origin, and they are not necessarily choosing to be on that side, but this is what they have in front of them. Here I have an old design of how the battle took place. I'm not going to go into too many of the details of the battle to leave Mary and Eric a little bit more space for that, but only to just say that the battle was extremely intense. There were many people who died in the battle, many people who were wounded, and from the 7,000 odd men who defended the king in the Battle of Ayacucho, after the capitulation, where the Peruvian contingent and Sucre, in fact, agreed to pay for everybody's return ticket to Spain, out of those 7,000 men, only 730 returned to Spain. And this is just to give you a feeling of how many of those people defending the king in the Battle of Ayacucho were actually from the region. Not only from Peru, also from what today would be Bolivia, what today would be Argentina, what today would be Chile. That was on the one side. On the other side, the people who fought for independence, who had come from all over the world. Many had come from the northern provinces of what today would be Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, then just known as Colombia or Panama. People who had come with San Martin from Chile. There were 60 Chilean fighters in this battle. Many men who'd still come from Buenos Aires, from Cuyo, from Mendoza. But every single man who defended independence was given Peruvian nationality. And that is another important thing to bear in mind. There's been a long debate over whether Peruvians actually fought for their independence or not, and I would argue that at that point, it is when we really can start thinking of the modern day Peruvian Republic. Before that, we are having a moment of creation of a new state, a new project that is only really going to come to fruition in the years after that. So, thank you very much. And sorry, that's a final picture of the battle. It was painted by a woman in the early 20th century, Teofila, I can't remember her last name right now, sorry.
Thank you very, very much, Natalia. That was a wonderful overview, excellent overview of the picture, and starting from the sort of worldwide, global sense of revolution, which was picked up on and energized really by Napoleon's invasion of Spain. So I'm going to give a bit of a more personal view of the Battle of Ayacucho. Oh,
That's
this
the
is also
capitulation,
yours.
yeah. Sorry, that's when they signed the Capitulación de Ayacucho.
Right, right. It's a great painting.
That's tomorrow.
So mine is called The Battle of Ayacucho, Simón Bolívar and Me. So bear with me on the me part. This is a very personal moment for me because on December 9th, 1824, my great-great-grandfather died on the field of the Battle of Ayacucho. So when I was a rebellious child in Lima, Peru, I was made to atone for my mischief by sitting alone on a hard stool in my grandparents' living room. It was an airless room, shuttered against the city's alternating sun and fog. There were musty books in shaky bookcases, an ornately carved piano, marble-top tables. There were bronze busts of Romans, and 5 ancestral portraits that seemed to regard me with pointed reproach. And 2 of the likenesses were of my beloved grandparents, peering down with what I never saw in their real faces, which one had a sharp look of haughty surprise with how ornery and naughty I was. And the other one had the soft gaze of infinite disappointment. These are the abuelitos. And you can see the sharp look and then the infinite disappointment on my grandmother's face. But the other 3 portraits on the walls were of an earlier vintage, and they were painted 125 years before I was born. One was of my great-great-great-grandfather, an imposing Spanish colonel named Joaquín Rubín de Celis, and he was known as the first man to charge and the first man to fall in the Battle of Ayacucho, which was, of course, the conflict, as Natalia has explained so well, that won Peru its freedom and liberated really the Spanish South America from Spain. Joaquin was born in Asturias and had joined Spain's forces when he was 16 years old, along with his brother, who was only 14 years old, and they had fought in Napoleon's invasion of Spain. They fought against Napoleon, of course. And then in 1815, together they joined the major expedition, which was the expedition of Pablo Morillo, which was sent to thwart Simón Bolívar's revolution that he had already started years before. From there, Joaquin had shipped out to crush the rebellious forces in Peru, and the wistful beauty that sat on the opposite wall of my grandparents' living room was Trinidad, María Trinidad Rubín de Celis de la Fuente, and she had been born a few weeks after her father had been deployed to the highlands of Cusco and Puno, where a few years later a rebel sword would pierce his heart. In a remarkable twist of more than 2 decades later, Trinidad married my great-great-grandfather, Pedro Cisneros Torres, a Peruvian soldier in Bolívar's army, who had charged across that plain on that chilly December morning to wield a sword against his father-in-law. So this is Pedro Cisneros de la Torre, and he literally had, many years later, married the daughter who never met her father and died on the plains of Ayacucho. So after 300 years of Spanish rule, the yoke of colonialism had been broken, the wars of independence won, and so although I had been instructed to sit in the gloom and feel bad about my mischief, I could only wonder at the marvels of rebellion. And a lifetime later, those faces are still with me. They hang in my study here in Washington, D.C. And as time passed, their stories, which fascinated me, made me want to learn more about the history behind the Battle of Ayacucho and more about the man who stood at the crucible of American possibility. And it was then that I decided to write about Simón Bolívar's biography. And here is my family. That is, my father was the firstborn of my abuelitos, but he is not pictured here. This is his brother Victor and his sister Eloisa. In my region of the world, at least, Bolívar had seemed to be alive, unlike any historical figure I could think of. For one thing, his image hung perennially, it seemed, behind the Venezuelan president. As you can see here, he is looking on as Vladimir Putin visits Hugo Chavez. So more than that, his mantle had been co-opted. Bolivar's mantle had been co-opted by just about every president followed him throughout the continent of South America. José Antonio Páez revived him and wore his mantle. Augusto Pinochet would say that he was another Bolívar. Fidel Castro also took the mantle of Bolívar, and Nicolás Maduro, as we all know. Even now, Bolívar's likeness continues to be summoned as graffiti on the walls, and you can see this here. These are real graffiti in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and there are even protest marches, as you can see in the bottom there, that still show his likeness. And can you imagine anyone summoning the George Washington's name, for instance, in a political protest today? I can't. But that's precisely how vividly Bolívar's legacy lives on in the Latin American imagination. So being a descendant of men who had fought in the most consequential battle of Latin American independence, I couldn't help but wonder about one obvious detail, and that was, why wasn't Bolívar on the Ayacucho battlefield on that fateful day? If his 14-year battle for independence had reached its apex on that very day, on that plain, winning the liberty of 6 republics, why hadn't he been there, leading the armies he had prepared so well? The answer is complicated, and it's a webwork of passions and betrayals. It began with the inability of José de San Martín, as Natalia has said, the liberator already of Argentina and Chile, to free Peru beyond the confines of the city of Lima. And so San Martín had been liberator of, it had been a fleeting insurgency, really, and it had been ignited by his decision to ignore his president's orders not to invade Peru. Now that he was cornered and unable to repel the Spanish forces that encircled Lima, troops that included my own Joaquin and Pedro, San Martín was forced to conclude that he and his demoralized troops could hold out no longer. So he desperately needed the help of a fighting force that was as fierce and as hungry as Bolívar's, as Bolívar was coming down rather from Venezuela, Colombia, what is now Venezuela, what is now Colombia, and through Ecuador. At the same time, San Martín couldn't help but be galled by Bolívar's impudence, his resolute march south. I mean, he was just coming for it. Nothing could really stop him. And he was threatening to take Guayaquil for Gran Colombia. And providentially, it was precisely then, with the resounding victory that Bolívar managed to prosecute in Quito, that Bolívar sent San Martín a letter offering the besieged general his assistance. So suddenly, San Martín had no choice, really, but to respond gratefully to Bolívar's magnanimous offer. And he wrote, I accept your generous proposal. Before the 18th of July, I will leave from Lima, and as soon as I disembark in Guayaquil, I'll make my way to you in Quito to discuss things in person. America will never forget the day that you and I embrace, unquote. So although San Martin was a proud, heroic figure, he seemed in shambles. Not only was he in physical pain from his wounds, having fought and crossed the Andes in the most remarkable way, he had lost the support of Lima's aristocrats. He had produced neither a Congress nor a constitution, and in the process he'd won many, many foes. When it was learned that he had sent a delegation to Europe seeking a prince from a royal family to govern the newly independent republic, Lima's Republicans were appalled. High-ranking officials were soon plotting against him, but it wasn't just in the halls of government that he was drawing fire. His naval blockade of the coast had strangled all of the Peruvian trade at the time, and the rich, influential merchants of Lima hated him for it. So in military matters as well, San Martin found that his power was crumbling. He was at odds with his own admiral, Admiral Cochrane, who saw his reticences to attack forcefully the Spanish forces outside of Lima as a deficit of courage. So perhaps worst of all, his soldiers had been reduced to a sluggish army of occupation. Within the course of one short year, he had lost all the momentum he had. So, stymied by political minefields and bewildered by the ferocity of his critics, San Martin now found the Peruvian animus against him so crippling that he was unable to recruit soldiers to his side. There was much he needed from Bolívar, especially the personnel, the troops. Risking everything, he decided to go and make a frantic alliance with the liberator. In mid-July of 1822, he set sail for Guayaquil, intending to march on Quito, where he assumed Bolívar had just won his victory and was sitting in place in Quito. But Bolívar was no longer in Quito. On the day that San Martin actually received the liberator's letter urging him to a meeting, Bolívar had already made a triumphant entrance into Guayaquil, which was a very valuable port, of course, in the region of in the Pacific. So less than 2 weeks later, San Martin's schooner, the Macedonia, and a convoy of Peruvian ships sailed briskly through the dark of an early morning toward the lush green island where they anchored momentarily. That sits the island of Luna that sits on the very mouth of the Guayas estuary. And it was July 25th, 1822. The port of Guayaquil was but hours away down the river, and San Martin was confident that he would now take possession of Guayaquil, a valuable port, for Lima. But immediately on dropping anchor, he was told that Bolívar already was in command of the city, and that green island to which he had sailed, like the province of Guayaquil, was now Colombian territory. Stunned, the Argentine refused to disembark. So we can imagine San Martin's consternation, the prospect of setting foot on soil that had already been so abruptly snatched from his grasp. It was one more indignity in a long string of humiliations. And the proud warrior was sick at heart. Messenger boats were traveling up and down the river, trading communications between the two liberators, until eventually San Martin decided to meet with Bolívar on the next day. The Macedonia proceeded down the river, majestically up the Guayas River, and arrived at Guayaquil the following day at noon. Bolívar went out to meet it, and oh, I'm sorry, I skipped that one. That should have been earlier. Slide. Bolívar went out to meet San Martin, and he boarded the Peruvian ship right away, and he greeted the Argentine with as much conviviality and charm as he could muster. The two heroes were left alone to conduct the first of 3 private conversations. They did so behind closed doors. No secretary, no guard, no third party was present for any of those meetings. and the details of their discussions have remained shrouded in mystery and dispute for centuries now. But we do know this. We know that Bolivar did not agree with San Martin's strategy of attacking the Spanish on two fronts, from the sea and from land. He commented as politely as he could that he thought it was a weak option. It would be far better, Bolivar said, to gather the liberating army and march it into the interior like a steel fist, deep into the highlands where the viceroy and his generals were lying low in Cusco. That was José de la Serna, who was the viceroy, and the chief general, José de Canterac. His army wasn't large enough, San Martin said. The Spanish had assembled a mighty legion in the highlands. San Martin had but the remnants of his original battalions. They were all sort of by now sluggish, occupational troops rather than a fighting force anymore. Plus whatever sailors who had abandoned the admiral and his cause, the admiral who had left the whole fighting force. So recruiting had not been easy. And San Martin now went to the heart of the matter. How many Colombians can you, Bolivar, contribute to the task? How many troops can I have? And Bolivar demurred, and he's citing the work that still needed to be done in the newly liberated lands of Gran Colombia and Venezuela and Ecuador. Controlling himself with great difficulty now, the Argentine implored Bolivar to come to Peru himself. He would even serve under Bolivar's command, if need be. The liberator could lead both armies. San Martin would report to him. Bolivar demurred again, and he said that as president of Colombia, he could not leave the country without Congress's consent. And surely they would never agree to it. But Bolivar didn't reveal too much because he didn't trust San Martin completely. The chemistry between them was all wrong. Bolivar left the meeting as somber and impenetrable as a sphinx, and San Martin left it deeply mortified. The liberator had everything that the Argentine wanted: a winning army, the acclaim of the people, the luster of success. That night, Bolivar had a celebration in San Martin's honor. There was music, there was dancing, there were beautiful women in beautiful gowns, clever speeches, generous toasts. But Bolivar had given his visiting dignitary absolutely nothing. Instead, Bolivar had walked away deeply apprehensive of San Martin's motives. As for San Martin, he was leaving Guayaquil with nothing to show and had been surprised by how little in common he had with his fellow liberator. He found him superficial, deceitful, childishly vain. The man had seemed to a career military man like San Martin, who had worn a uniform since he was 12 years old, the very antithesis of a soldier. San Martin sailed down the Guayas River, bound for, really, history, and some would say oblivion. And as he did, his animus grew. The first words that San Martin uttered before Lima's opening Congress on Friday, September 20th, announced his resignation. His decision was accepted without debate. At 9 o'clock on that same wintry night, he stole away on horseback, and he abandoned the capital for the coast, leaving very much as he had come in the night. He was convinced he was helping Peru by clearing the way for Bolivar, but in so doing, he left the brand new republic leaderless, rudderless, and in utter chaos. Pressed by one of his ministers for an explanation, San Martin gave the one that only a bitter heart could muster. He said, quote, "There is no room in all of Peru for General Bolivar and me," unquote. So chaos was precisely what Bolivar found when he sailed into the Peruvian capital. General Sucre, his right-hand man, who had been ordered to prepare Lima for Bolivar's arrival, had been singularly unable to calm the turmoil of a populace that was riven between its loyalty to the crown and its desire for more economic freedoms. As Natalia has said, business of taxation without representation just was gripping the world. There were two presidents in charge, President Riva Agüero, cast from office and chased from Lima, but still clinging stubbornly to his presidency, and President Torre Tagle, who had gone so far as to invite Spain to come back and return to colonial rule. Not long after Bolivar's arrival, the Peruvian Congress begged him to take full power, begged Bolivar to take full power and wield a dictator's scepter. Sucre had advised against it. Bolivar himself was reluctant. He had hated when he watched Napoleon take on the crown. But it was clear that only a strong man could save Peru from slipping back into Spain's clutches. So he took extraordinary power into his hands. Bolivar now threw himself into transforming his army into the steel fist that he had said he needed to drive into the heart of the Andes, where the viceroy and his generals were lying low and quartered. He established a base in Trujillo, where he demanded the participation of every household and oversaw the production of every horseshoe, every piece of artillery. He was ripping at it when he found himself standing up at one point and ripping his pants. He got the idea to harvest every single nail in Trujillo to melt down and make into arms. He outfitted, trained, and honed for warfare all of his troops as they headed for the Sierra. And in the Sierra, as Natalia said, he trained them to be adjusted to the altitude and to the cold. As Bolivar's, you can see how difficult this trip would have been. As Bolivar's liberating army streamed down the promontories that you see here of Cerro de Pasco, looking for a fight, it had yet to meet the enemy and know who they were. General Canterac, too, had yet to meet his enemy. And the one that he thought he knew was hardly worth worrying about. Canterac had won every battle he had ever fought against the ill-organized, ill-trained seekers of independence. As far as the Spanish general was concerned, he possessed the superior army, a mighty force that had stymied San Martin, bested Santa Cruz, and taken the city of Lima twice in the past 6 months. So General Canterac finally emerged from slumber on August 6th to ride out on a reconnaissance with 1,300 troops. He had heard, really with a chill of surprise, that the entire Patriot Army had crossed the Andes under his watch and was headed for the town of Jauja. By then, Bolivar and 900 horsemen had already drawn near, looking to provoke the Spanish general, to a fight, to battle. The Battle of Junín was fierce and fast. Not a shot was fired, not one cannonball was exploded. The terrible silence was really punctuated by sounds of steel against steel, wood against wood, the old bugle call, the pawing of horses, the grunts of men, and the thuds and cries of the fallen. As hostilities continued, the Spanish drove too far into Patriot lines, exposing their own flanks, and the move ensured Bolivar a stunning victory, a resounding victory. Night fell on a plain that was littered with the dead and wounded and riderless horses wandering around the plain in a daze. The Royalists had lost nearly 400 men, 100 more had been taken prisoner, and the Patriots had lost 145. But as Bolivar's army moved on to Huancayo, their leader was handed a surprise. It was a letter from the Colombian Congress in Bogotá, and it was revoking his extraordinary powers. In it, the liberator was advised that, and this was 3 months before, it took so long for the letter to get there, he had been stripped of his status. The rationale, described very thinly, was that in accepting a dictatorship of Peru, he had rescinded Colombia's presidency and its military command. So those responsibilities now belong to Francisco de Paula Santander, who was Bolivar's vice president. In a subsequent dispatch, Santander was even more stern. He ordered Bolivar to hand command of all the Colombian troops in Peru to General Sucre. It was an absurd directive, a rude affront. The men of the military understood, even if their politicians did not, that the liberation of Peru had been undertaken for the greater glory of Colombia. It was the dominoes falling, as it were. If one country, if one region was not liberated, the others would soon lose their freedom. So if Peru continued to remain under Spain, all the liberated publics would be at risk. That had been their motives in taking the Ecuadorian land, and that had been the motives in Quito. It had been the understanding in Guayaquil that you were taking piece by piece. Bolivar could see his vice president's hand in this betrayal. There was no question that the long-held jealousies that Santander had for Bolivar and his preference, Bolivar's preference for General Sucre, had quickened Santander to the task of destroying Bolivar as best he could. General Sucre, on the other hand, was appalled by the insult to the liberator. He dutifully informed his officers of Congress's decision, although the slight to every warrior in his ranks were clear. The liberating army existed precisely because of Bolivar. To separate the liberator from it was to separate him from his soul. Bolivar stopped sending long, chatty, candid memos to Santander. His correspondence became clipped, correct, communicating only what was necessary. The liberator rode back to Lima in early December of 1824 and was met with jubilant welcome. The people of Lima, more Republican than ever after his victory at Junín, welcomed the dictator with adoration. He wasted no time in focusing on his priorities and utilizing what power he had. Within hours, he imposed a siege to starve into submission the royalists who had remained in Lima and gone to Callao and boarded themselves up in Callao. He defended the periphery of the capital with fresh troops. In turn, by December 7th, the two opposing armies under Sucre and Canterac had marked their ground near Ayacucho. But by then, the royalist soldiers had traveled longer, faster, even on more precipitous terrain, suffering many privations. They had been marched in strict columns, the Spanish had been marked in strict columns to prevent wholesale desertions. They had not been allowed to travel into valleys or into villages where provisions might be found. They had been forced by starvation to eat the flesh of their own mules. But on December 8th, they took a stronger position. They lined up on the majestic heights of Cundurcunca, overlooking the broad, flat plain of Ayacucho. And as they circled the area, they were able to engage the Indian troops, or the indigenous troops, that were helping Spain, not the patriots. So on December 9th, on the day, 200 years ago, today, when dawn broke over the heights of Cundurcunca, it brought with it a absolutely resplendent sun. It was a brilliant sunny day. It was one of those cool, crisp Andean mornings when the air is sheer tonic to a soldier's vigor. At 8 o'clock in the morning, as the sun warmed the air, one of the Spanish generals, a tall, sturdy man with a russet beard, approached the Patriot lines and called out to one of the generals on the other side. There were soldiers from the same families fighting on opposite sides. He said, would they be allowed to say hello to each other, say goodbye to each other before the hostilities began? And so it was that 50 men of the opposing sides met on the slopes of Cundurcunca, among them a number of brothers, to embrace and to weep as one chronicler had put it, in a heartbreaking display of farewell. Surely my own ancestors, Joaquin Rubin de Celis and Pedro Cisneros, looking at one another across that sun-drenched plain, could hardly imagine that within 2 decades, they would share a family tree. The battle was fierce, short. The royalists clambered down Cundurcunca in their red, gold, and blue and their full regalia, laboring mightily under the banners, their helmets glinting in the sun. And the Republicans in their dark, somber uniforms lined up to meet them. Before the bugles sounded, Colonel Rubin de Celis, my great-great-grandfather, was first to attack, and he was also the first to fall, and he was pierced by a well-aimed sword in the heart. Even with that loss, the royalists took immediate control of the action. They descended on the Republicans like a horde of punishing angels, cleaving their formation so that it gaped, momentarily helpless. But the setback spurred the patriots to a higher resolve. By 1 in the afternoon, they had taken the heights. By mid-afternoon, the field was littered with the dead. Before sundown, Canterac offered Sucre his unconditional surrender. Perhaps it was the exhaustion after so many weeks of forced marches, or a terror of Bolivar's famed barbarian hordes, or the dizzying altitude, which at over 10,000 feet can take the very breath from you. Or perhaps what prevailed in the end was Sucre's brilliant strategy to make the royalists work harder, climb higher, march longer, then strike with a virulent force. The news reached Bolivar more than 10 days later in Lima, even as he was struggling with the Pandora's box that Peru had become. It is said that when he read of the general's victory, General Sucre's victory in Ayacucho, he abandoned all decorum, leapt in the air, leapt on a table, and danced through the room, shouting, "Victory, victory, victory." Sucre had won it for him, and Sucre would have his undying gratitude. With Ayacucho, Spain would be evicted from America's shores forever. It was Bolivar's Yorktown, it was his Waterloo. With one single resounding triumph, all of South America, Spanish South America, would be free. And in my family, a 5-year-old daughter, Trinidad, would mourn her father, not knowing that 20 years later, she would marry a man who had fought him on the other side. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now for Eric Langer's presentation. I'm very eager to hear it. Professor Langer is a professor of Latin American history in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service and the History Department. He received his PhD at Stanford University. After 14 years at Carnegie Mellon University, he has taught at Georgetown University since 1999. Dr. Langer has published 8 books and over 60 scholarly articles. He was director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Georgetown from 2009 to 2013. Dr. Langer was awarded multiple awards, including 4 Fulbright Research and Lecturing Awards, 2 Social Science Research Council Awards, 2 National Endowment for Humanities Research Fellowships, as well as the Orden Universidad Central de Venezuela. He was elected honorary member of the Academia Boliviana de Historia in 2016, and he is presently working on publishing the selected writings of Francis Burdett O'Connor, an Irish aristocrat who fought during the South American independence wars and remained in Bolivia for the rest of his life. Dr. Langer.
Thank you very much, Marie. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Peruvian Embassy, to the Kluge Center, to the Hispanic Reading Room for letting me be part of this, and Marie as well, who is really the organizer of all of this, and so really deeply appreciative. Francis Burdett O'Connor died on October 5th, 1871, in Tarija, Bolivia, at the age of 80. He actually left behind 2 testaments in which he both mentions his actions at the Battle of Ayacucho. In the 1860 testament, which in the end was superseded by the other one, but this one is actually more interesting, he narrated his importance in the Battle of Ayacucho, and in a sense also was saying, this is why I am here, this is why I can be in Bolivia and die in Bolivia, rather than going on to Ohio country, actually, where he wanted to go, and then colonize with other Irishmen. So let me briefly read this for you. You have it right here as well. I incorporated myself into, and this is the 5th point in his testament, which isn't that long, so this is really a very important part of this. I incorporated myself into the liberating army at the orders of General Sucre in the headquarters of Huaraz, where the officials and troops that had arrived with me from Panama were mixed in with different units of the army, and I was named by the Liberator, Bolivar is, the Chief of General Staff of the United Army of the Liberator. I accompanied the army to the fields of Ayacucho. I chose the position to place the army, which was not approved by the General-in-Chief, which was Sucre at the time, but I remained firm, and the battle was won with it, myself being the only individual who was not awarded a higher post from General Sucre to the last cadet for not wanting to send to the Liberator a false report. General Sucre wanting me to put in the report as present all of our dispersed, of which there were more than 1,000. So this is a really interesting quote for a number of reasons. One, because of course he asserts that he was there, and this has to go in his last words and testament, but also that he has certain resentments there as well, and still brings something up that he felt clearly very strongly about until the end of his life. So O'Connor defined himself as a liberator and saw this as his justification for being able to live in Bolivia from when he first set foot in 1825 to actually never leave again. He briefly went to Peru during the Peru-Bolivian Confederation, but essentially remained in Bolivia afterwards. In fact, he was so important, according to James Dunkerley, a British historian, who then asserted that O'Connor was the 3rd man of South American independence, that is after Bolivar and Sucre, in various publications that he wrote. O'Connor is a really interesting man in many ways because he was born in 1791 in Cork, Ireland, of an aristocratic family, and came to the Americas in 1819 as part of a Irish legion that the British actually sent so as to help the Spanish, and I think also to get rid of lots of Irishmen who might otherwise fight for independence. He also brought about 10,000 pounds of gold with him to pay for ammunitions, and he also bought some of that. And in the end, he fought first in Colombia with the Irish Legion, but then, in fact, it was disbanded, but he remained. And once the Irish Legion was disbanded, he was sent to Panama to train troops, which he did in 1823. And then later that year, he was very impatient. He really wanted to get back to fighting again. He then was able to go to Lima and then go up to Huaraz, as we heard about in the testament, to fight with Bolivar and Sucre in the Andean campaign. Now, his statement that he was the chief of staff, in fact, is questionable. As Natalia said, actually it was Agustin Gamarra who was chief of staff of the whole army. But in fact, according to him in his autobiography, which was published posthumously, he asserted that he had been named the chief of staff of the army by Bolivar, but that for some reason Gamarra was put into his place, and at that point he offered to resign and actually go back to the unit that he had brought over from Panama, but that Sucre had persuaded him that he could then be chief of staff of the Army of Colombia rather than of the complete army, and he remained there. Also in the chapter on the Battle of Ayacucho, he asserts that when the battle comes about, not only Gamarra disappears, and he is kind of the person who remains in charge. Now, whether that in fact happened or not, we don't know. But certainly what is, I think, important is that he actually asserted, as he said in the Testament, and this was his claim to fame, that he persuaded Sucre to remain in the place that he did, because Sucre thought that he should actually descend down to the plains and engage the enemy, but instead he remained in the heights and let the Spanish engage first. And in fact, there was this this quebrada, this stream bed in the middle, which kind of protected the Patriot troops. And when the Spanish tried to engage, that's when the Patriots attacked. And in the end, as Marie just told us, the Spanish troops were exhausted, and they were able to, in the end, win the battle against them. And of course, this is for O'Connor also a huge triumph, because again, he really only lost one engagement ever in his life. He later fought against the Argentines as well. He fought during the Peru-Bolivian Confederation, and he never really lost a battle in that particular case. But for him, this was really the high point of his life. Now, this is going to form part of, part of the diary that I'm publishing with Margarita Robertson in Bolivia. And in fact, he wrote in Spanish after 1823. The first diary which we have is from Panama, and he wrote that in English, but after that he switched to Spanish, which I think is really interesting. Now, what you have here in front of you is the annotation of the diary for the Battle of Junín. Because unfortunately, and as you can see, it's actually this page, and let's see if we can go on. Let's see, it's not, there we go. And this page, just where I have the line up here. It's a very short entry, in fact, and you can read the whole thing here, which I'm not going to read this time around, but this is it translated into English. The problem is that the diary, in fact, this particular one ends in September 25th, 1824. So the Battle of Ayacucho, unfortunately, is not there. That has a lot to do with how the diary itself has been preserved, because, in fact, as far as we can tell, it was divided up into 3 different parts and given to 3 different people. So I was able to obtain the first part from the 1820s, and then the last part, which is the longest one, from 1849 to 1863. But this part is missing, and probably precisely because it has the Battle of Ayacucho in it, it probably was given to that third person as compensation, because the other 1820s diaries are actually the ones that I have. Fortunately, as I already said, O'Connor actually wrote an autobiography, and this is one copy thereof, which was published after his death. And it's in this autobiography, he actually dedicates a whole chapter to the Battle of Ayacucho because, again, for him, this is the most important thing. The Battle of Junin actually only takes half a chapter, whereas the Battle of Ayacucho much more. But of course, as Marie described so well, and also Natalia, the Battle of Junin was much shorter as well and much less complex. So the thing is that for O'Connor, the Battle of Ayacucho is really a central part of his identity. And also, in the end, in fact, it became that because of a battle that was not fought. And that is that when the Battle of Ayacucho finished in 1824, he moved on with Sucre into Alto Peru, which later became Bolivia. And at that point, you still had another person who was a royalist with his army, Pedro Antonio Urdaneta, who was actually a royalist, but a royalist of the old kind, which meant that he was in favor of the king rather than the Constitution of 1812, which is what actually the viceroy of Peru, Abascal, was for. So they had in fact fought, but here was still a major region where the royalists were in charge. And so Sucre then tells O'Connor, go with your troops and get Urdaneta and finish him off, and then we're done with all the battles. Well, the thing was that, in fact, Urdaneta was engaged in another battle. His troops rebelled against him, and he was killed. And so by the time O'Connor got to south of Potosi, there was nothing for him to do. And in fact, what he then did, he went on to Tarija, which is in what was a disputed territory between Argentina and Bolivia, and eventually, under the command of Sucre, with his troops, made Tarija part of Bolivia. So O'Connor is important not just because of Ayacucho, but also because a large part of Bolivia, and of course Bolivia lost some territory since then, became part of Bolivia against the United Provinces of La Plata, which later became Argentina. Also, importantly, is that he later married and settled in Tarija and became frontier commander. He became probably the largest landlord of all of Bolivia, and he became Minister of War for a while as well, and many other things, and this is why the diaries are so very useful. In fact, one of the things that I'm doing with Erica Wisby, who's right here, my research assistant, we're figuring out the postal system of South America based on those diaries. So there's exciting things that you can do with all of this writing as well. But the important thing is, and with this I will end, is that he always claimed to be a liberator first. That was really why he thought that he could remain in Bolivia, because at that point there was no such thing as naturalized citizenship or anything like that. In fact, he asserted he never voted. He also never helped a coup. And he became, in many ways, a strong man in Tarija, but his identity remained mainly as liberator. And thus, the Battle of Ayacucho is so important even for somebody like Francis Burdett O'Connor, this Irish aristocrat who found himself in the middle of the center of South America, and that's where he remained for the rest of his life. Thank you very much.
Eric, thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions, and I want to have you think about your questions while I ask one question, I'm being told. Okay, does anybody have a question? We have a microphone here. Right here?
Right here.
Thank you so much for your great presentations. Historians claim that Napoleon, I guess, inadvertently enabled South American independence. And mentioned here that he invaded Spain in 1807, installed his older brother Joseph to be the king of Spain, and then the colonies were not sure who is the king. The king was not the king, but was also these 4 Atlantic colonies of Argentina, Uruguay, Colombia, and Venezuela declared independence in 1810 and 1811, well before the Pacific colonies, so to speak, because the Spanish crown repatriated officers and soldiers from these colonies to assist the fight against Napoleon, and that enabled them militarily to gain their independence. So the Peru and Bolivia, the battle, by the way, Ayacucho was fought near the today's Bolivian border. But anyway, the question here is why they had to wait another 15 years for the other provinces, the Pacific provinces, to gain their independence. And the question, I think it is because these 2 colonies were major suppliers of precious metals to the crown. The route was shipping to Panama through the Pacific and then transferring overland to the other Atlantic port of Panama and then shipping it back to Spain. So that's why the Spanish concentrated their defenses more in the Pacific colonies, where they used to get their precious metals. So I just wanted to check with you on these points.
That's a great question because, you know, we do owe Napoleon a lot for having invaded Spain and then rendering Spain helpless. But Natalia, you want to?
The only place that actually declared independence early on was Venezuela. They created a republic in 1811. So the juntas were autonomous organizations, but were not really calling for independence. They wanted to have certain autonomy during the absence of the king. It's only when the king returns in 1814 and asserts his presence that they will push areas like what today we would understand as Argentina to create what then they gave the name of the United Provinces of South America. So the process of actual independence was not as simple as certain areas wanting to be independent. It was just done in Venezuela, which is quite small. And even in Venezuela, the regions of, for instance, Maracaibo never accepted that, and Bolívar had to fight a war immediately in 1811, 1812, 1813, with people within the same region that were also defending the king. Of course, the silver mining it was very important. Potosí particularly was fought between the people sent by the Junta de Buenos Aires from the south and the Viceroyalty of Peru. So there was a conflict over the control of silver, for sure. But it wasn't as clear-cut as they were independent in 1810. They had these juntas, and the nations now celebrate those bicentennials, and those dates is the most important, but it wasn't just that. Chile, for instance, proclaimed independence not really until Maipú, even though they had a junta between 1810 and 1814, and then there was an invasion from Peru in 1814. So there's a lot of complexity there. And I think it's also very important to remember that we tend to shorthand and say the Spanish and the Patriots. And that is really not what we're seeing here. We're seeing people from the Americas and people from the peninsula that understood themselves as Spanish and then eventually slowly start to understand themselves as Colombian, Peruvian, Chilean, and so forth.
I want to ask before we close, because we're going to close very soon, we started late. I want to ask 2 personal questions of our guests here. I want to ask Eric, what was it that fascinated you about this Irish aristocrat who came to fight in the Wars of Independence? What was the spark?
Well, 2 things. First of all, the largest number of diaries that I have are from a good friend of mine who passed away by Eduardo Trigo O'Connor Darlach. So they kept that name. And so at least in because I told him I would publish this. Unfortunately, he passed away before I could publish it. But beyond that, for me, these diaries are unique. There is nothing like that otherwise in South America. Certainly other foreigners had diaries, but Spaniards usually didn't write diaries. So this is from a person who remains in South America for the rest of his life. So we have an idea of daily life. We have an idea of what happens. For example, one thing that I hadn't really thought about, but it's actually quite logical, he got sick a lot. The water wasn't very good, right? You don't think of elites getting sick all the time, but in fact they do. Another thing is, people never came to work on Mondays. Even when he wanted to, Blue Mondays, they were still hungover from the night before. And there's nothing he could do. He was the most powerful man in all of southern Bolivia, and he couldn't make his workers come to work the day that he wanted to. So there are all these absolutely fascinating things that are part of this. And of course, the independence diaries are also unique. Thus, for example, the pieces that I showed you right here have never been seen before and haven't really been used for this because nobody had ever published them. They remained in the hands of private people who never thought that maybe this might have some value and should really be public for everybody to see.
Well, thank you for making that accessible, so accessible to us. Natalia, I have a very brief question for you, and that is that you were supposed to be today standing in Ayacucho on the field celebrating this incredible bicentenary. So you have a personal relationship with that landscape. What was your impression? What was your feeling standing there?
Well, it's overwhelming. I've been to Ayacucho many times and to the Pampa itself many times, and I've seen the commemorations, how the whole town gets together and remembers. You see the statue from the airport. You see it from the city. It's a presence. It's a very important place.
Thank you very much for sharing this bicentennial of the Battle of Ayacucho and the freedom of Spanish South America. Thank you very much for joining us today.